Good morning, everybody. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the President and CEO of the Pacific Council on International Policy. We're delighted to have you here today for this joint session with the Wilson Center on the future for AI nationalism. We're delighted to be able to collaborate with the Wilson Center, my alma mater, of course, and delighted to be able to welcome our three speakers, but in particular, to begin with, Kellee Wicker, who is the director of the Science and Technology Innovation Program at the Wilson Center. She brings with her over a decade of policy and international affairs expertise to the role, as well as a lifelong passion for technology. In her role at the Wilson Center, Kellee aims to illuminate emerging technologies and scientific advances that will impact numerous parts of life worldwide, while helping to shape the policies designed to bolster and manage the innovation cycle. I can personally testify that Kellee is an extraordinary colleague, always very, very willing to collaborate, but also does extraordinarily important work with staffers on Capitol Hill and really fulfilling the mission of the Wilson Center to engage with Congress. Kellee, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and we're so pleased to co-host this with you.
Wonderful. Martin Rauchbauer is the co-founder of the Tech Diplomacy Network, a platform for practitioners representing governments, civil society, and global tech companies to tackle planetary challenges with frontier technologies. Previously, he served as Austria's first tech ambassador in Silicon Valley. And for those of you who aren't aware of the importance of that role, a number of governments maintain a tech ambassador in Silicon Valley to engage with all of the major developments that take place in Northern California. He served as Austria's first tech ambassador in Silicon Valley, where he shaped the emerging field of tech diplomacy, engaged in transatlantic digital diplomacy and digital human rights, and developed digital humanism as a strategic focus of Austrian foreign policy. He's passionate about bridging the gap between diplomacy, arts, technology, and the environment, and has published and lectured on these topics. Currently, he also serves as the executive director of the Gerasi Resident Artist Program, one of the world's leading artist residencies. Martin, let me just say that that gap between diplomacy, arts, technology, and the environment is something that we feel very strongly about at the Pacific Council, and we're delighted to be able to work with you today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Duncan. It's great being here.
And lastly, to moderate our conversation today, a very dear friend of mine, Vishal Kapoor, who is the COO of Chia Network. He also serves as a member of the Global Advisory Council at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. He's a seasoned technology executive, having served as CEO of Paradata, a machine learning-based RPA platform for supply chain data analysis. Vishal is also a partner at Three-Legged Stool, a company focused on developing software solutions for the COVID-19 crisis and beyond. Earlier in his career, he held leadership roles in engineering, sales, and product management at Alcatel, Silicon Access Networks, Vericity, and Cadence. He began his career contributing to the discovery of the Higgs boson by building big data and tiered data acquisition systems at the superconducting super collider for the US Department of Energy. Vishal, thanks very much for supporting us here today. Thanks for being here, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Duncan. Let's get started right away with the definition, right? So, Kellee, for you, when we talk about AI nationalism, what does it mean in today's geopolitical context?
That's such a great question. You know, there's so much of AI in everything now. And so a lot of people have AI strategies that are trying to leverage AI for national security directly. But I think when we talk about AI nationalism, we're specifically talking about the ability for a country to leverage, to create an AI ecosystem through specific inputs. We're talking about access to computing power. We're talking about national data stores and pools. We're talking about infrastructure that underlies all of this, and we're talking about talent. And so it's less about actually using AI and more about the ability to harness it and create it within your national borders. And so I think this is what's driving a lot of this race to purchase computing power, where you're pitting corporations against countries in the quest for chips, and many of the other various international competitions that we're seeing kind of boom and some new ones spring up.
Thank you. So, you talked about kind of these factors that underlie the talent pool, the resources, etc. Martin, let me ask you, from your perspective, you talk about planetary challenges. Is this a planetary challenge? Are we underestimating it? Are we overestimating it? Where do we stand at this juncture in terms of the growth of AI and it being a planetary challenge?
Yeah, well, I think that artificial intelligence is certainly both a challenge and an opportunity for the planet. And when I talk about planetary challenges, I talk, about really the survival of us and the survival of our planet. And artificial intelligence promises a lot of solutions, but then there are, of course, also challenges that are of common concerns for humanity. When we talk about nationalism, as Kellee correctly pointed out, we talk really about which country, which nation controls and has access to the necessary elements of an AI ecosystem. And the real challenge from a planetary perspective or from a global perspective about nationalism is we need collaborative ways to tackle these planetary challenges, and therefore, an increasing level of nationalism, fragmentation, particularly when it comes to these promising technologies, might also come in the way of the necessary global collaboration for meeting these challenges.
Okay, so in the spirit of just starting to tackle our hardest problems, right? We've heard a lot of conversation around regulatory frameworks, nationally, globally. In the last couple of decades, we haven't been able to agree on any kind of regulatory framework for baseline technologies. Kellee, what gives you confidence or pause that we can get to a regulatory framework that is both relevant and enforceable?
Ah, geez. If I could figure that out, I'd be richer than I am right now. I think, I think we're going to want to harmonize where we can, certainly. I'm not sure that we ever will be able to come up with a global regulatory scheme that is going to work for everyone, but there's kind of a couple of different things that need to happen. First of all, there's essentially two camps. A lot of countries would disagree with this characterization because they're not in either of the camps, but there's kind of two camps right now. There's the camp that kind of believes in the ability to use AI for surveillance and control. I am purposely characterizing that in a very negative sense because I disagree with this. And this is espoused by countries like China, but also countries that we're friendly with, like India, that have security issues, and this is an opportunity that they see. So it's not to paint people that are going that route as all bad, all of them are our enemies, but that is a sense that we don't necessarily agree with the United States. And then you have the US EU kind of conception of AI as empowerment for individuals, but a thing that needs to be our individual freedoms need to be protected from it as well as enabled by it. And this is a very different view. So I think those two views are never going to be in coherence with one another. I think we are always going to end up with essentially two different regimes that are guided by these principles. What we can do, what we need to do, is agree on basic definitions. So we might regulate these things differently, but we need to agree on what constitutes risk, how we measure that, what are the tests for it, and apply those same definitions across all the regimes we develop. We need to be talking about the same things when we use these words. That also seems incredibly difficult at this juncture, but I think that's step one, and that is a thing that we can do with people that we disagree with on the eventual use of it. We can get in a room with China and with other people that we sometimes have trouble with and figure this out, and we should.
Martin, I had a follow-up for you, but you can certainly pick up from wherever you like in the conversation. My follow-up was, It's what Kellee painted is a really interesting dynamic, right? So if we got really blunt about it, for the most part, people are talking about the US plus EU and China. Talk a little bit, given that you've lived on both continents, what are the differences between the EU lens and the US lens? Because when I observe it, even those don't seem close enough. So I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I thank you for that question, because I agree with that there is a kind of bipolarization, in the big geopolitical landscape between the United States and China. And it has something to do with values, underlying values that are important for artificial intelligence. All the discussions about AI ethics in reality are about what are the underlying values in our AI systems, and how do we control them? How do we monitor them and its effects and impacts on our citizens? But however, there is another issue, and that has something to do with control, which is, on the one hand, there is fears and anxieties about the technology itself. This idea of AI might one day, get out of control, which is actually a concern that we probably share as a humanity in all countries. And then there are, of course, issues of control, as Kellee mentioned it, between countries that want to centrally control artificial intelligence, because they might, see it as a maybe a threat to their regime, or also as a possibility for surveillance. But then there's also another aspect, and I think here the difference between the United States and Europe comes into play. And that is, first of all, from a European perspective, there is the question of the relationship between private tech companies and the state. I think that from a US perspective, many of the US-based global AI-based platforms, in some sense, have to make the basis of the US lead in artificial intelligence, whereas from a European point of view, there is increasingly a feeling of having, of dependency from those private companies, not even so much a dependency on the United States as a nation state, but on private-led companies, on private tech leaders, even in foreign policy terms, and an increasing call, particularly, looking at recent developments and possible future developments in US foreign policy. There's an increasing call for Europeans to develop an AI sovereignty, or an AI independence, not so much from the US, but from big international corporations.
That's fascinating, right? Because if you look at China, one could argue that they are the only one of the three constituents that have a national-driven AI strategy, right? China 2025 has always had an AI component, a blockchain component, etc., and they're executing to it. So it feels like in China, you have the exact opposite of what you have in the US, where a lot of the tech is driven through the private sector, and the government is becoming a bigger and bigger customer of that. Kellee, as you look at, as you sit at the center of those two dynamics, what are some of the conversations that are happening in DC? Are they happening more at an educational level of trying to understand what are the limits of this technology and what should we be worried about? There was, there was a news came out of the Homeland Security Department today that there's going to be policy around AI. And then when I started to read through it, like, okay, but can we actually get down to the specifics? So my question, maybe just, it's two parts. So let's go with the first part, which is, as you're in DC, what are the 2-3 top concerns or questions that you hear on the Hill?
There's a few themes you hear frequently. Obviously, we've already talked about it plenty. China, the top theme, and I think, you know, kind of to some of the things Martin was bringing up. I think the basis for where the US diverges from the EU in terms of policy is derived from this question. How
Mhm.
much are we willing to sacrifice at the altar of staying on top? And the answer apparently is quite a bit.
Mhm.
Where you see, you know, the EU Commission hearings that have been going on right now, there's a lot of talk of like using the Digital Services Act, using the Digital Markets Act to bring tech giants to account, to
Mhm.
protect people, to rein in the immense power that these unelected bodies are holding. We're not having those conversations here. What we are having is conversations about how can we enable, how can we go faster? How can we accelerate? How can we, you know, guardrails? We love talking about guardrails, but how can we stay on top?
Mhm.
And so there's a lot of conversations going on about how can we understand what's real, what is happening in China, where they actually have an edge. We tend to take what they say at face value, which is a terrible decision because they can say anything and we have no idea what the reality is.
Mhm.
But you know, there is very much this feeling that we are losing our edge and that there is national security implications for this. The second concern you hear frequently is workforce.
Mhm.
Are they ready? And
Mhm.
if not, who is responsible for getting them ready? Is that private companies? Is that employers? Is that the government? And these questions, this conversation is much less coherent than I would like it to be because I don't think we've crystallized it enough to actually do something about it. We have not determined who is responsible for preparing the workforce for the AI-enabled version of the future of the work. And increasingly, people are starting to take their foot off the gas because they keep hearing in the news that the AI boom is over.
Mhm.
It is very much not. The bad parts of the boom, the froth is calming down, which is a good thing, but
Mhm.
AI is here. And I think, you know, in the new administration coming in, I think we are going to see an increasing turn toward government not taking the role of helping the workforce find their footing in the new world. And so the question is, who will? And then I think the third thing that we hear a lot is what is the role of tech in government service delivery?
Mhm.
And this kind of was raised a lot by the executive order from last fall. A lot of what the Biden administration said was start using this.
Mhm.
You are in charge of using this. You are in charge of understanding where to, you know,
Mhm.
the Department of Labor is in charge of the use of AI for labor purposes. And so if there are abuses and discriminations, it is your job to do something about that. And so this question of talent and implementation and adoption, I think this is actually kind of relevant to the workforce conversation larger because this is the government is having the same conversation that workplaces will very soon. How do
Mhm.
we do this? Who do we ask for help? What tools do we purchase?
Mhm.
Um, and I think it's important that we are having those questions because again, that will inform how we help other people answer these questions. Um, I think I might have ranged a little further from the question you asked me. So remind me if I missed any parts.
No. I think it's important, and let's park one thread. About what the governments are doing from a defense perspective, because I think when you look at that, and Martin, I'd love to get your perspective on that, right? When you look at it from a defense perspective, all governments will do whatever it needs to bolster their definition of defensive readiness, and the public sector has been involved. The private sector has been involved forever. So certainly in the U.S., right, we're talking about new players, but the Northrop Grummans of the world, right, have been involved and in a very strong relationship there. I think the thing that is not that clear is this dynamic we've had over maybe the last 2 decades, where because of the lack of transparency out of, say, China, right, we don't know where they stand. And at times we step back and say, well, they're not further along. And at times we just panic and go, they're going to take over everything. And I think that it's reasonable and healthy to recognize that there isn't going to be a set of global standards, because that's just something we've never achieved in anything, right? We haven't achieved that in trade. We haven't achieved that, in basic tech. I think that when, my question is, when you're in US and China, you probably get these boogeyman kind of conversations, right? All the problems in the US, tend to be focused on China, and probably vice versa. Martin, could you give us maybe, hopefully, a sobering perspective of how the EU and maybe even strong players like Germany and the UK, I recognize that they're not technically in the EU, but in Europe, look at the dynamic on either side of them?
Yeah, no, I think that when I listen to Kellee, on the concerns in Washington D.C., and I think that they're to a large part also shared within the European Union. There are clearly feelings and fears about losing out, in all sectors of the economy in a kind of to the competition from China, and that, of course, also includes the defense sector, that includes all part of the economy. I think where Europe is at the moment really struggling is the question whether its own concerns about AI safety and AI security, which it tackles through regulatory responses that Kellee mentions, the DSA, the DMA, the AI Act, whether they, on the one hand, provide the kind of answers to these concerns, but at the other hand have maybe some unintended consequences by decreasing the competitiveness of the emerging EU AI system. So there's a lot of concerns about the EU losing in this global competitive context, its own competitiveness of its own AI industry. And I think when we talk about AI nationalism, we will see on the part of the European Union a lot of attempts to create an AI infrastructure of its own in order to decrease these dependencies. When we talk about the EU's efforts globally, we always look at the EU as a regulator in general. That's what it's known for. But I think what the EU is increasingly aware is that there needs to be a huge amount of investments, both coming kind of from the Commission as well as from national governments. And you see that there are in France, in Germany, okay, the UK is now outside of the European Union, but there's increasingly a discussion on how to foster homegrown AI ecosystems. It will have a lot to do, I think, with the AI infrastructure that needs to be homegrown and independent.
Can I piggyback on that a little bit?
Please.
Actually, to widen the lens? I know we're doing the thing that we always do, which is talk about the US, the EU, and China. And one of the things we've been trying to do a lot at our program lately is to talk about the global South more. There are a lot of other players who would like to have AI ecosystems. And I think this is a really interesting moment. Back to that question of these two value systems that express themselves with very different regulatory regimes, but like the underlying values, we're kind of in a hearts and minds situation. And so when you have a lot of countries, you see some countries like the UAE have the resources to make the investments that Martin's talking about the EU making as well. They can actually plunge billions into compute, internet access, increased data centers, more power for those data centers, new universities that will be focused on AI. And they're seeing a lot of success with that. Every country would like to have some kind of sovereign AI guarantee. They are struggling to do that for obvious reasons. Many countries struggle with connectivity. If the EU is having to invest in infrastructure and so is the United States, just imagine, what is Tanzania supposed to do? this is a really important moment for democratic powers that are in a position to extend a hand of assistance and collaboration. China has for forever been doing the Belt and Road, and we lost this battle with telecoms. They showed up with money, they showed up with tech, they showed up with infrastructure. And the only catch was that it was all going to be Huawei, and people were happy to make that trade. If you are an African country, why would you not? They are not part of our ideological war. They are just trying to get things done. They, in the last Belt and Road strategy document, very purposely said that part of this now was the expansion of AI ecosystems around the world, and they're painting us in the United States as obstacles to that. If you are a smaller country and you would like to become more powerful in the AI world, we are not the ones who are going to help you with that. We are the stumbling block to that. I don't think that's an accurate portrayal, but we certainly are not helping, and we could. This is the time to show up with the development inputs that they need to start building their ecosystems at home. And this is a great opportunity for us to be friends in that way. I think it's also really important that we do that not in a sense of this paternalistic development relationship where we show up and we help you because you're so miserable and terrible. This is a time for us to be collaborators, to acknowledge the benefits that we can reap from increased AI development around the world, and to use this as a diplomatic opportunity to again grow the people who are thinking about AI in the same value set as we are.
That's really, sorry, Martin, were you about to add something?
Yeah, no, I think that there's an additional element from a European perspective. I think that we need to understand, and the countries that we might call that are sitting kind of on the fence in this kind of growing geopolitical division. That they don't want to necessarily choose, between the US and China. But would rather keep channels of trade, channels, of political cooperation open with both sides, so to speak. And therefore, what they really are interested in is not being kind of constantly lectured, but what they're really interested in is collaboration and investment. And there, I think, when I think about the EU is the largest development and cooperation contributor in the world, that the EU needs to be a lot more strategic about its own resources in that respect. And I entirely agree with Kellee that there is a huge potential, to offer collaboration for those countries. As well as, from a perspective of the global South, I don't think that it is in our own interest, and when I talk about, aligned countries, if we create an even ever widening gap of access to those resources. So, whether or not we always align and agree with every country that we are collaborating with, and I think the very fact that we offer access to infrastructure and access to resources is in and of itself in our interest.
That's really interesting. And I'm glad that we talked a little bit about the global South, right? Because in some sense, the bigger powers are always taking whether it's a paternal or a let me just help you out approach, right? Whether it's Belt and Road or the US approach. I think the way I want to kind of take this conversation is there is a national security element, there's an economic element, and then there's an international economic element, and then there is a national economic element, right? And Kellee, I do want to come back to the labor piece a little bit later in the conversation. My question to you is is it time to accept that the world is divided into, right? We've deglobalized at least into the autocratic quad and people who are willing to work with them, the US and its allies. Is it time to consider a NATO of tech, if you will, right? Where you could have a regulatory framework, you could have a framework where if you get attacked disproportionately from an economic perspective or from a military perspective, then we're here to help each other. I know it's a very kind of crazy idea to ask, but is there an equivalent that we need to consider when it comes to the new tech world?
Martin, I'd be interested to hear from you, given that you've had this diplomatic background.
I mean, I personally think that we need to be careful when we look at the kind of language that we employ to even describe the current situation. You know, I know that some foreign policy analysts and experts in the US say we need to use the language of the Cold War to describe the current situation and just describe it as what it is. You know, it's a new tech Cold War. Where technologies and AI and quantum are the big assets, when it was, you know, at nuclear energy and nuclear weapons in the old Cold War. This is what really is the defining element of the new Cold War. We just need to acknowledge it and basically organize our alliances and our strategic interests according to that. And I think that that's very dangerous, because those very wordings then create a reality that we necessarily do not want and also do not need. I think what is very, very different from the old Cold War is the absence of a clear ideological confrontation that was kind of pretty absolute during the Cold War. I think that there are major differences between the major AI powers, so to speak, and they are based on values, and they're based on a different approach to the role of the state versus its citizens, and they're based on a different approach towards human rights, for sure. But there are also a lot more similarities than there were in the past. There are a lot more areas of collaboration. And there's also a need for collaboration that is unprecedented. We need to work together in order for you know, AI not getting completely under control, whether in the military sector or whether it is you know, on all aspects of future AI developments. And so I do believe that there is a real need for diplomacy and a real need for global collaboration, and probably a multi-level approach. You know, in some areas, countries, big powers will compete economically. In other areas, they will be adversaries. And then there will be yet another level where they will actually collaborate and need to collaborate.
Yeah, oh, that's excellent. I'm reminded of this statement which says, right, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. So while your caution is, you know, very well received, right, there is also an importance to recognize that while it's not the same ideological challenges that we had during the Cold War, there are still ideological challenges. And to your point, there's also the element where we have to recognize what the new dynamics are. I'm going to just take a second. There are a couple of questions coming in. Let me see this one.
While you look at those, just really quick, I also wanted to throw in one other difference that makes it very difficult for nation states to think about operating as if it's a Cold War or having some kind of block that they agree on defending one another is the inclusion of very powerful commercial interests.
Yes.
You know, we like to pretend that these tech companies that are housed in the United States are part of our power, but they're very much their own thing. And, you know, even pre the AI boom, there was a lot of discomfort with when Google would do what an autocratic regime told them to do in order to have access to that market. And we don't love that, but we don't really have any control over it. We cannot necessarily anticipate the companies that are in the United States, that are in Europe, that are in Canada,
Mhm.
to be some kind of extension of our governments and our belief systems. They are companies. They exist to make money. And that makes this all extremely complicated.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's interesting that you bring that up because there's certainly a thread to be pulled there at a different time about the rise of plutocracy, right? That are we at a time where the economic power of companies exceeds the economic power of certain countries, and should we talk about that? But I want to bring it back to, and there's a couple of questions around this as well, right? Which is around, so are there any examples, Martin, of collaborations between countries that give you hope?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the EU and the US in reality are working very, very closely together. There is a, starting with the outgoing Biden administration, there's been very, very close collaboration on trade and technologies. There's regular meetings between the EU and the US, even though there are those differences. And I think that on certain issues such as safety and security, there's also been a collaboration, between all the major AI powers. And there's the question is there a need, and this has been also discussed, and we try to ask these questions as a tech diplomacy network to the countries that we collaborate with. Is there a need for a new institutional setup to manage this international collaboration, not unlike, for example, the collaboration that countries have in the nuclear sector with the International Atomic Agency? Is there such a need to create an international agency? And I would say, apart from the institutional difficulties, I think that there is a need for a formalized institution. One of the lessons from the Cold War is that it actually helps kind of a lot to avoid conflicts by talking to each other. And I think we at the moment have a lack of these channels of communication on a regular, constant basis. This is also one of the ideas of tech diplomacy. We need to, diplomacy in reality is about a number of principles, even among and between adversaries, establish permanent channels of communication, and also think about managing international relations on the basis of reciprocity. That's also what diplomacy is about. The complexity of the geopolitical landscape requires also complex approaches, networked approaches, global approaches, which is a challenge in our, with our traditional multilateral system. So I think it would be well worth thinking about how we find a kind of new approach, maybe a multi-stakeholder approach that includes these new and unprecedented players in the international system. The global platforms are certainly a necessary part of this dialogue.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating, right? Because we touched upon the Cold War and NATO and things like that, and your caution that we don't repeat that. And I think we cannot repeat it. I was just looking at a framework for collaboration because we are the first generation where technological advancements within our lifetimes are seismic, right? Before, when you talk about any other, this generation worries about the Cold War because of, the nuclear bomb, etc. For us, we've had mobile, cloud, AI, quantum, blockchain all happen in the last 30 plus years, and we're just learning about that. I think it's interesting, Kellee, you touched upon something that was asked by one of the audience members as well. Let's dig a little bit into that, which is the dynamic between private companies, which have their influence that is global, while you've got national or multinational, but not necessarily quite yet global interests. So is there a sense of resignation that these large companies are moving at such a pace that it isn't in the best national interest to curb them because you might get left behind? But then that comes with the danger or risk that because you're not regulating it, because it's just moving so fast, that we'll reach the point of our fears where they won't be able to way to crawl back. Is that something you think and worry about? Or what are your thoughts on that?
I think, yeah, I think, and even the companies themselves, and I realize frequently when tech companies ask to be legislated, it's because they have a very specific version they'd like to be legislated. But I think genuinely a lot of the people who work at the major labs right now are the kinds of people who are genuinely concerned about the societal risks posed by this technology, whether we're talking about long-term, very massive risks or the immediate impact of algorithmic discrimination against people. They are genuinely concerned, and they're the ones who built it, so they know what's possible, and I think there is a very genuine desire for the government to step in. The question is how? A lot of the shorter term risks, I think, are manageable in a legislative sense. Like we know what to do about it. If you are using algorithms to make decisions about housing, employment, healthcare, etc., then you have all these checks and balances. There should be someone that you can appeal to if you feel that you've been unfairly decided against. These are things that the government does this very well. This is a very well-tried framework. It's when we get into this question of what is the safety questions, I think the reason government is having a lot of trouble with this is that is again back to we lack the definitions. What constitutes a risky system? How does one measure that? How does one audit it? And so we have all of these very good ideas about like, oh, well, we'll just limit we'll limit and track the creation of high-risk systems. We'll have third-party audits. Okay, well, that brings up even more questions. First of all, what is high risk? So far, what we've done is said, well, high risk is this amount of compute and this amount of money. That doesn't actually correlate with, that correlates with the power of a model, but not the risk level of it. Some of the riskiest models are very narrow models that were created, purpose-built for a very specific harm. Those would not be covered by any of this legislation. Even in the tech sector, we're struggling to grapple with this understanding of what constitutes risk. How is government, who do not have degrees in computer science, how are they supposed to handle this? And so I think there's a slow response because even our best efforts that are in the federal body that, California's recent bill, they were considering the things that the EU had already passed and will pass, that they are limited by this ability to actually address limiting AI risk because we can't even figure out where it's going to come from or how to measure it. And that's something that we have to, that's something that the technical side of the house is actively trying to figure out. How do you benchmark risk? I actually talked to a PhD candidate in Switzerland yesterday who is developing a benchmark test for risk, which is a fascinating concept. I have no idea how it works because we didn't get into that part.
Yeah.
People are thinking about this. The good thing, it's going to have to come from the technical side of the house first, I think.
Yeah. Kellee, I'll push back on a couple of things just to see if we can dig deeper, right? One, I'd say that the statement that the government is good at regulating things
comparatively.
Yeah, and maybe things that have been around for 10, 20 years, right? The rate of development is really really fast. And I think the challenge we face here is, again, back to the fact that you all Noah Harari, right, who is a philosopher disguising as a historian and an author, right? He talks about the fact that we are, for the first time, entering a phase where AI is heading is that you have a rise of a digital organism that could supersede the biological organism that is humankind. And that risk piece is really, really interesting, because how do you define the risk of a technology that is non-deterministic, right? One of the things that we, in my day job, right, worry a lot about, we're working with companies to build systems which are around data provenance. If you're going to have bias, but you don't know what data it's based on, then how are you going to do it? And then there is also the provenance of results. That, hey, this AI was asked, this AI agent, so it's very targeted, was asked these series of questions. Did we capture what answers it's giving? Because it's a non-deterministic system. So I really like the idea of thinking through the risk, but I agree with you that that's a massive challenge. I didn't want to leave one of the topics that you had teed up, and Martin, I wanted to get your thoughts on. Every technological disruption, every major technological disruption that requires labor retraining or risk of labor disruption starts with an alarm bell, and then over time it normalizes out. Sometimes it normalizes out because there are alternate jobs that open up. Sometimes it normalizes, to Kelly's point, where there is very good job training that's put in place. What is your view on how governments can approach this in the context of AI?
Well, I think that that's a correct statement in the long term of history. When we look at past historical disruptions, for example, the beginning of the 20th century, it was probably a wise thing, not to protect horse-led carriages, and try to prevent the advent of trains. However, when we also think of previous technological disruptions that affected society, we also know that they led to upheavals and societal tensions, and even maybe some people say that that there's a strong causality between major technological disruptions and civil unrests and even wars. So we have to manage this transformation very, very well, and clearly that protectionism is not necessarily the answer to it, but training and a national concerted efforts, as well as an international collaborative effort, is needed to prepare for this transformation. I do think, coming back to the question of whether governments are equipped to manage it well and to regulate it well, I do think that sometimes the unintended consequences of regulation lead to an almost opposite effect of the intended regulation. If you put too much burden on technology companies to comply with regulation, the big companies that you think you're targeting are actually the best equipped to deal with this regulation, but it's the small and medium-sized ones that then are kind of crowded out, because you really then create market entry barriers. So that's something, a discussion we are having a lot in the European Union, whether these big regulatory efforts don't have these adverse effects. And I think the answer to that is we also need to think in innovative way of how to regulate. If you just think of how long it takes, even in the EU that is so proud of its regulatory results, but any kind of legislation that passes the EU takes years. And what we saw in the EU AI Act, which really started 5-6 years ago, then once it was kind of ready, then the generative AI started, and EU legislators were aware that our legislation is maybe not really the right one. So I
Yeah.
think we need innovation in regulatory we need sunset clauses, we need regular reviews in order to adapt, maybe not as fast, but certainly as regular as the pace of technology proceeds.
On that note, actually, there's my staff, if they're watching this, they're going to crack up because I cannot not bring this up constantly. But one of the things that we can borrow from our friends in the global south is innovative regulation and legislation, because many countries are using regulatory sandboxes to really experiment with how to legislate and regulate emerging technologies. The definition of a regulatory sandbox is as varied as the grains of sand, but the ones that are most exciting to me are the ones where you have the intent is not to provide space for entrepreneurs to build. Those are very interesting too, but some of them, the intent is to give government a place to play, a place to test without, because to Martin's point, in both of our regions, it takes us 10 years to get something done, and then we're not going to come back to it for 50 more. So you better hope it was good. In the sandbox, you have government working hand in hand with the people who are building the tech, understanding in real time what the impacts of these decisions would be if it was rolled out nationally. That's really exciting. I think Senator Rounds has proposed a regulatory sandbox in the United States. I don't imagine that will be a popular, I don't know what the possibility of passage for that is. I would probably put it pretty low, but other people are doing this really well, particularly in Latin America. And we can certainly watch and learn and then bring those ideas back to our own country, which I think that's where we don't want government to move fast. It's good when it moves slow and cautiously. In this moment, though, we need a mechanism where government can move fast without permanent long-term effects. And I think that is a really interesting thing to watch.
Oh, that's really interesting. I was recently in London, and I was at an event which was about the business of blockchain, and it was amazing. Half the people were from the regulatory side, which to me was just interesting because that's not what I'd expected the audience to be. And they were talking about these regulatory sandboxes, which really makes a lot of sense, because the skeptic would say that in the US, of course, we're not concerned about the regulatory framework hindering innovation, because we have such big lobbies that we're asking these tech leaders and their representatives to help us shape the regulation, right? And Kellee, you alluded to that earlier. But I think these sandboxes are important because you have to have some separation between the innovators and the regulators. And I'm also reminded, a place that I want to go next with you, Kellee, right, is that one of my favorite phrases is that innovation is turning ideas into invoices. And it's a very sobering one, because the economic driver at the end of the day is only going to be superseded by the national security drivers, right? But the economic driver is pretty significant, which takes me to, Kellee, you and I have talked about supply chain traceability and the challenges around that. We cannot leave a conversation on AI nationalism without talking about TSMC in Taiwan. Floor is yours.
No, man, what an open-ended question.
I have to, because I don't want to put my bias into it, but I definitely want to hear your perspective on that.
Like in terms of access to chips or the outsized power that they have, or
yeah, let me put a little bit of context, right? So I think that when we talk about nationalism, we haven't yet talked about the fact that there's a growth of nationalism, right? Where countries are saying, well, why am I going to try to figure out my place in the global world? It's easier for me, and maybe even more important, to say, this is what it means to be an American, a German, or whatever might be the case. And I'm not suggesting that these two countries are doing something extraordinary in a good or bad sense, but there's an increase of nationalism. So then there's the question that if the NVIDIA chips and the chips that are going to come out of the Middle East funding for the next gen of AI chips, if those are regionally outside of the US, and we can certainly talk about the CHIPS Act, which is the right first step, but a really, really small one, and one that doesn't recognize that to build a semiconductor infrastructure or rebuild one is not a 2-year effort, it's a 7 to 10-year effort. But my point, maybe I'll just ask it then more directly, is TSMC is in Taiwan. A lot of the leading edge chips are manufactured there. There is a geopolitical dynamic going on there. How concerned should we be about that dynamic? And do you have any indicators that either one of you see that give you hope or fear about basically Taiwan and, you know, the control of that country, region?
Yeah, no, yeah, the Silicon Shield is so important and so delicate.
Mhm.
And I think what I do not think we should do is reproduce vertical chip supply chains in every single country. That would be patently insane and also impossible.
Impossible, yeah.
I do think, again, you know, TSMC is at the end of the day a company. And so
Mhm.
when they took CHIPS money to build a fab in the United States, and I believe they built a couple in Europe too, they are in the process of building, maybe in Germany, I'm not sure. They're building fabs outside of Taiwan. The Taiwanese were kind of like, whoa, man, hold on. Like we need you to be here where you protect us. But you know, TSMC is going to make financial decisions. They're going to make economic decisions. I'm sure it is in the back of their mind that there are geopolitical consequences for those. But I also think TSMC having more facilities is not going to weaken Taiwan's importance, certainly. It is just kind of crazy how much of the chips, you know, leading edge chips is concentrated in such a small place. I don't know what to expect, I particularly don't know what to expect with the incoming administration in the United States. I don't know if the resolve to stand with Taiwan will remain the same. I don't know. Sometimes I feel that some of the newer voices coming into Congress seem to have this conception that Taiwan can fall and everything will be back to normal, and that is definitively not true. Taiwan would be step one. This would be the Sudetenland, and then we continue. I think it would be naive to think that we could cede Taiwan, but I also understand that, like, we are talking about, you know, global warfare. I think there's a lot of things that are going on. You know, we're in such a weird moment where there are so many things that probably should be considered acts of war that are digital that we do not consider acts of war that are taking place now. There are, you know, cultural and battles going on for the Taiwanese people, information warfare that's going on. These, you know, the ideal version of this, I feel, for China would be for Taiwan to simply stop. And then there is no call for the United States to come step in because there was never a war. They just decided to be Chinese. And that sounds insane, except for the fact that this information warfare in the social media age, just the fine tuning of those mechanisms is so exquisite. And there are things that are possible now that did not used to be possible even 10 years ago. That is my like wildest projection, is that is what the hope will be. The hope will be that the Taiwanese themselves give up. It is not worth living in fear. It is not worth living in the shadows and constant naval patrols. It is not worth it. And that they will give up. I hope that they don't.
Well,
that's the craziest
really,
version of that
yeah, I was like,
conversation probably we
okay,
could have had.
maybe that was too big a question. So as we're wrapping up, and Martin, I'll start with you. We've had a conversation. We talked a lot about the things we need to do, the things we have to do, the fears we have. What gives you hope?
I personally think when we talk about the future of AI, that a lot of the anxiety that we see among citizens has also something to do with the lack of information about these technologies. You fear what you don't really understand. And I think that there we are going to see some positive changes. I think that the people, the citizens, are getting used to these new technologies. And I think we're in some ways understanding, if we just think of the discussions we had over the last years about the effect of social media on our, on our psyche, on our minds. I think that there is a lot more awareness about this now, and I think the same will happen with artificial intelligence. I think we will start to familiarize us more with these technologies and understand it better. Because ultimately, this is not just about, what kind of decisions do the top policymakers make. It's about where do our citizens go? And I believe that the positive effects and the positive promises of AI will, together with the experiences and the understanding of its potential dark sides, will empower us, and I'm not just saying us in the West or us in Europe and the United States, but globally, to maybe see them also as a tool to tackle some of the most complex challenges. If we want to fight climate change, we will need a very, very complex system to do that. And maybe, some of the AI systems will be helpful in that. So that's my hope, without saying that there's not also good reason to be really, really concerned about this whole technology getting out of control.
Thank you so much. Kellee, we have a few seconds. I think we might be a bit over, but I'd love to hear something hopeful from you as well.
Yeah, so I'm going to steal from, we're putting out a Wilson Center-wide report soon on reasons for optimism, reasons for hope. I'm going to steal mine from that, which is that I am so extremely bullish on AI for the acceleration of science. Shortening timelines for drug discovery, for materials science discoveries, for just any kind of science, being able to automate labs so that we don't have technicians in there toiling away. We have people who are able to experiment quickly and rapidly. Digital twins for simulating different things and exploring and predicting. I think that's just, it's so exciting, it's so incredible, and it's just this enormous frontier. The things that will enable then to be created is explosive, and I can't wait.
That's fantastic. I'll wrap up by just saying that whenever there is something that we don't understand, right, it leads to a lack of trust. And the place that I work in, right, we spend a lot of time talking about that the first step towards trust is transparency. And I think that we need to take that even further left based on what you were saying, Martin, which is, and that starts with education. I often tell people that in today's day and age, if you don't understand something, and if you haven't spent 15 minutes on Google or a chatbot to just try to understand what you're talking, what you're concerned about, then that's on you. So to your point, Martin, I think that there's a huge amount of resources available for us to self-educate, and we can't wait for the governments or institutions to tell us. And Kellee, not surprisingly, given that we share a passion for technology and what it can do, that gives me the most optimism as well, that it might be overblown what we think is possible at the dystopian edge of AI. And given too much focus on that, we might be losing sight of what is possible with the technology that's available today and maybe over the next 3 to 5 years. So I want to thank you both for taking the time. I've been getting some messages from the people who are participating that this is one of the best conversations I've had, and couldn't be done without the two of you. So thank you so much.